Gallipoli, April 1915. Just after 0400 hours, the first waves of British and Anzac troops churned through the pre-dawn Aegean, their landing craft scraping against unfamiliar shores. The Allied command, ensconced miles offshore on battleships, anticipated a swift, decisive thrust through the Dardanelles, a strategic artery to outflank the Central Powers and relieve the beleaguered Russian front. This operation, conceived in the high offices of Whitehall, promised to be a swift, surgical strike, a testament to British naval supremacy and the presumed martial inferiority of the Ottoman Empire. The stakes were immense: control of a vital sea lane, a potential end to the stalemate on the Western Front, and the preservation of imperial prestige. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Williams, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers, stood braced at the bow of his assigned steamboat, peering through the gloom towards the looming cliffs of W Beach. His men, packed tight with rifles and entrenching tools, hummed with a nervous energy, a blend of apprehension and the conviction of inevitable success. War Office intelligence reports, disseminated weeks prior, had painted a picture of thinly spread, poorly equipped Turkish defenders, their morale supposedly brittle. Williams had reviewed the aerial reconnaissance photographs, noting the rudimentary trench lines, but the prevailing sentiment among his peers was one of an almost ceremonial opposition. The initial bombardment from the Royal Navy's battleships, a thunderous prelude that had begun hours earlier, was expected to have softened any significant resistance. Shells weighing hundreds of pounds had arced over the horizon, designed to pulverize fortifications and demoralize the enemy. Naval gunnery logs recorded over 2,000 heavy shells expended against the landing zones in the preceding 12 hours, a volume of fire calculated to render any entrenched position untenable. This overwhelming display of force was intended not merely to destroy, but to psychologically incapacitate, ensuring the infantry's advance would meet little more than disoriented stragglers. Yet, as the ramps dropped on the first lighters, a sudden furious fusillade erupted from the scrub-covered ridges above. Machine gun fire, far heavier and more organized than intelligence had suggested, tore through the packed ranks of advancing soldiers. Rifles cracked with a chilling precision, targeting the exposed figures struggling through the shallow water and onto the shingle. The carefully choreographed landing, designed for speed and surprise, devolved instantly into a desperate scramble for cover, the beach transforming into a killing zone. Williams watched, aghast, as men crumpled into the surf, their shouts replaced by gurgles and the metallic clang of dropped equipment. The Turkish defenders, far from being demoralized, were dug in with an unexpected tenacity, their positions expertly camouflaged and their fire disciplined. Ottoman military records later revealed that elements of the 19th Division, under Mustafa Kemal, had been meticulously preparing these defenses for weeks, anticipating an Allied landing with a shrewd accuracy that belied British assumptions. Their Maxim guns, positioned in mutually supporting emplacements, swept the beach with an unyielding curtain of lead. The initial casualty figures, compiled from field reports by midday, were staggering. The 1st Lancashire Fusiliers alone reported over 600 killed or wounded out of an initial strength of 1,000, a loss rate of 60% within the first few hours. Similar reports filtered in from other beaches, painting a grim tableau across the entire landing front. The expectation of an easy victory evaporated with each falling man, replaced by the stark, brutal reality of entrenched and determined resistance. The initial disembarkation onto the coastal plains, a landscape of low-lying scrub and occasional cultivation, offered little immediate indication of the trials ahead. British topographical maps, often decades old and compiled from cursory surveys, depicted a terrain far more benign than the reality that confronted the arriving battalions. The expectation of swift vehicular movement across open ground a cornerstone of their tactical planning, began to unravel within the first few kilometers inland. What appeared on paper as gentle undulations proved to be a series of deeply incised wadis, dry riverbeds that transformed into impassable torrents with the slightest rain. These natural trenches, often 10 to 20 feet deep and choked with dense, thorny acacia, fractured the landscape into a labyrinthine puzzle. Vehicles, particularly the heavier supply lorries and artillery tractors, found themselves confined to narrow, pre-existing tracks or forced into arduous, time-consuming detours that stretched supply lines to their breaking point. Unit diaries from the 4th Infantry Brigade reveal a consistent lament regarding the unforeseen obstacles and the crippling effect on march rates. A planned advance of 20 miles often devolved into a 2-day slog, averaging less than 5 miles per day. This drastic reduction in mobility not only hampered offensive operations, but also made the rapid redeployment of forces, crucial for counterinsurgency, nearly impossible. The very soil itself presented an unexpected challenge. During dry periods, fine, powdery dust, often several inches deep, coated everything, fouling engine air filters and clogging rifle mechanisms. The dust reduced visibility and exacerbated respiratory ailments among the troops. Conversely, even moderate rainfall transformed the same ground into a treacherous, adhesive mud, immobilizing vehicles and rendering footpaths impassable. Supply consumption rates, based on European theater logistics, proved entirely inadequate for this environment. The constant strain on vehicles traversing rough terrain led to accelerated wear and tear, particularly on tires and suspension systems. Fuel consumption soared as engines labored through sand and mud, and the increased physical exertion demanded by the environment meant water and rations were consumed at rates 30% higher than projected. This environmental friction, a constant, abrasive force, eroded morale as surely as it wore down equipment. The officers, trained in the broad, sweeping maneuvers of European warfare, found their doctrines ill-suited to a landscape that demanded painstaking, localized engagements. The terrain itself became an antagonist, silently but relentlessly working against every British objective. The patrols, initially conceived as exercises in flag-waving and intelligence gathering, began to return with increasingly grim reports. Small units, often no more than a dozen men, would venture into what the maps still designated as pacified territories, only to encounter an unexpected and often savage rebuttal. The first significant engagement occurred near a village called Kohat, where a company of the 24th Punjabis, while attempting to disarm a local chieftain, found themselves ambushed from 3 sides. The ambush was not the disorganized rush of a tribal levy, but a coordinated assault employing cover and flanking maneuvers. Snipers, concealed within the rocky outcrops, targeted officers and non-commissioned officers with unsettling precision. Damage reports from this initial clash indicated 14 British casualties, 6 of them fatalities, alongside 27 wounded native troops. The enemy, identified only as local insurgents, melted back into the hills with minimal losses, leaving behind only spent cartridges and a chilling sense of their discipline. This pattern repeated itself with disturbing regularity. Reconnaissance missions, intended to map the terrain and identify potential strongholds, frequently devolved into sharp, brutal skirmishes. The insurgents, often operating in small, mobile groups of 20 to 50 fighters, demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the landscape, using its contours and hidden paths to their advantage. Their weaponry, initially a mix of antiquated Jezzails and captured Enfield rifles, proved surprisingly effective in the close-quarter, high-altitude engagements that characterized these encounters. Intelligence assessments, compiled from captured fighters and local informants, painted a picture of a decentralized yet highly motivated resistance. These were not professional soldiers, but villagers, farmers, and tribesmen, unified by a fierce determination to resist foreign occupation. Their tactics, though lacking the formal structure of a European army, were perfectly adapted to the environment: hit-and-run attacks, sabotage of supply lines, and the systematic elimination of collaborators. The concept of a quick, decisive victory, once a comfortable assumption, began to erode with each casualty report. The British officers, trained in the grand maneuvers of European warfare, found themselves ill-equipped to counter an enemy that refused to stand and fight on conventional terms. Their heavy artillery and massed infantry, so effective on the plains of Flanders, were cumbersome liabilities in the narrow mountain passes and hidden valleys. The very notion of pacification became a cruel irony, as each attempt to assert control seemed only to ignite further resistance, drawing more men into the insurgency. The cost in lives and morale steadily mounted, far exceeding any initial projections. The initial British tactical response to the escalating unrest adhered rigidly to established colonial doctrine. Formations, honed on the parade grounds of Aldershot and proven against less agile adversaries, emphasized disciplined lines, concentrated firepower, and direct engagement. Officers, trained in the conventional warfare of European battlefields and the suppression of poorly armed uprisings, anticipated a swift application of force would restore order, much as it had in countless territories before. Their operational manuals, steeped in the experiences of the Sepoy Mutiny and the Anglo-Boer Wars, offered little guidance for an enemy that melted into the landscape. Patrols, often comprising 30 to 50 men, moved with a deliberate, almost processional cadence along predictable routes. The intent was to project authority and deter assembly, but this predictability rendered them vulnerable to ambushes from unseen positions. Intelligence reports, often gathered through local informants whose loyalties were increasingly divided, frequently underestimated the depth of popular support for the resistance. The British command structure, accustomed to clear chains of command and discernible enemy formations, struggled to identify and neutralize a decentralized network of fighters. These combatants, often indistinguishable from the civilian populace, operated in small, fluid cells, striking with precision before dispersing. The resistance, by contrast, embraced a strategy of attrition and psychological warfare. Their tactics, born of necessity and intimate knowledge of the terrain, focused on disrupting supply lines, isolating garrisons, and inflicting casualties through hit-and-run attacks. Improvised explosive devices, often constructed from scavenged materials, became a signature weapon, turning routine patrols into exercises in nerve-wracking uncertainty. Unit diaries frequently record the frustration of encountering an enemy that refused to stand and fight in a conventional manner. One regimental entry from late 1903 lamented, "They fade into the hills like smoke, leaving only the dead behind." This elusive adversary negated the numerical and technological superiority of the British forces, rendering their artillery and machine guns largely ineffective against dispersed targets. The British logistical apparatus, designed to support large-scale conventional operations, became a target itself. Supply convoys, moving along exposed roads, were vulnerable to ambushes, forcing the diversion of significant manpower to escort duties. This stretched already thin resources and limited the effective deployment of combat units. The psychological toll on British troops mounted steadily. The constant threat of ambush, the inability to distinguish friend from foe, and the pervasive sense of being watched eroded morale. The traditional markers of military success, captured territory, defeated armies, were absent, replaced by an endless cycle of patrols, skirmishes, and retaliatory actions that seemed to achieve little. The British reliance on punitive expeditions, often involving the destruction of villages suspected of harboring insurgents, proved counterproductive. While intended to deter support for the resistance, these actions frequently alienated the local population further, driving more individuals into the ranks of the rebels. The cycle of violence intensified, each British reprisal fueling greater resentment and resolve among the local defenders. The initial skirmishes, dismissed as minor inconveniences, metastasized into grinding engagements. British casualty reports, initially thin and focused on minor wounds, began to swell with entries for severe trauma and fatalities. The medical infrastructure, designed for swift, decisive actions, strained under the constant influx of mangled limbs and shattered bodies, a stark contrast to the clean wounds anticipated from a brief campaign. Company strength, once a reliable metric of fighting power, began to fluctuate wildly. Unit diaries recorded a steady depletion of experienced NCOs and junior officers, replaced by green recruits whose training, while thorough in theory, proved insufficient against an enemy who knew every fold of the terrain. The logistical burden of replacing these losses, often from reserves thousands of miles away, introduced delays that further exacerbated the frontline attrition. A typical infantry battalion, designed for sustained combat with a complement of 800 men, found its effective fighting strength reduced to under 400 within weeks of continuous action. Ammunition expenditure rates, initially projected at 50 rounds per man per day, frequently quadrupled during sustained defensive operations, placing immense pressure on the supply lines. This disparity between expectation and reality created a perpetual state of deficit, both in manpower and materiel. The psychological toll became increasingly evident. Letters home, once filled with bravado, adopted a somber, weary tone. Reports from field chaplains detailed a rise in cases of combat fatigue and despondency, phenomena largely unacknowledged in the pre-war military doctrine. The relentless nature of the fighting, often without clear objectives or discernible gains, eroded the initial conviction of a swift and righteous victory. Regimental quartermasters struggled to maintain adequate stocks of even basic necessities. Uniforms frayed, boots wore through, and the quality of rations deteriorated as supply chains stretched and buckled under the strain of continuous demand. The meticulous order and discipline that characterized the British Army began to show fissures, not through outright mutiny, but through a pervasive weariness that dulled efficiency. The strategic planners, isolated in distant headquarters, continued to issue directives based on outdated intelligence and an underestimation of the enemy's resolve. Their maps, pristine and unmarked, bore little resemblance to the blood-soaked ground where men fought and died. The gap between the perceived reality of the campaign and its brutal truth widened with each passing day. The dust motes danced in the antechamber, illuminated by a single high window, as Major Thompson traced the lines on a captured insurgent map. It was crude, hand-drawn, yet it depicted a network of trails, hidden caches, and village alliances far more intricate than any intelligence brief had suggested. The official War Office maps, crisp and precise, showed only topography and established settlements, utterly failing to convey the living, breathing infrastructure of resistance that now choked every British advance. Thompson's initial assessment, echoed by his peers, had been one of simple banditry, a localized nuisance to be swiftly suppressed by disciplined troops and superior firepower. The skirmishes of the first few weeks, however, had escalated from isolated ambushes to coordinated attacks on supply lines and forward outposts. Casualty reports, initially dismissed as unfortunate but manageable, began to paint a different picture. A regimental medical log from October recorded 27 British fatalities from small arms fire and improvised explosives, compared to 12 in the preceding 3 months combined. The tactical briefings, once focused on parade ground maneuvers and decisive engagements, now increasingly detailed the elusive nature of the enemy. They melted into the landscape, reappearing where least expected, their knowledge of the terrain absolute. Patrols returned with tales of villagers offering smiles and hospitality by day, only for the same paths to be mined or ambushed by night. The distinction between combatant and civilian, a cornerstone of conventional warfare, blurred into an indistinguishable gray. Interrogation files, compiled from captured individuals, provided fragmented but consistent narratives of deep-seated grievances and a fierce, almost spiritual attachment to the land. One villager, under duress, simply stated, "This is our home, you are not." This sentiment, repeated in various forms, began to resonate with an unnerving clarity. It was not merely a fight for territory or resources. It was a struggle for existence, for identity, against an encroaching foreign presence. The sheer scale of the local commitment became undeniable. Production logs from captured workshops showed a steady output of crude but effective firearms, often repurposed hunting rifles, and thousands of handmade explosive devices. This was not the work of a few disaffected individuals, but a widespread, community-backed effort. The logistical challenge of sustaining such an insurgency without external resupply lines of any significant scale highlighted an internal resilience that defied conventional military logic. The officers, initially confident in their training and the might of the empire, found their assumptions eroding with each passing week. The enemy was not a uniformed army to be met on an open field, but a diffuse, pervasive force drawing strength from every hamlet and every hidden valley. The prospect of a swift, decisive victory receded, replaced by the grim realization of a protracted, grinding conflict against an opponent whose will seemed inexhaustible. The scorched earth policy, initially a tactic of desperation, solidified into a grim doctrine for both combatants. Villages that offered even the slightest perceived aid to the insurgents were razed, their inhabitants displaced or worse. British field reports from late 1879 began to detail a new category of pacification measures, which included the systematic destruction of crops and livestock in areas deemed uncooperative. Zulu warriors, in turn, escalated their own reprisals. Any British supply train, even those under heavy escort, became a target for ambushes that left no survivors. The practice of taking prisoners, once a rare but acknowledged possibility, ceased almost entirely. Deserters from the Natal native contingent, captured by Zulu patrols, faced immediate execution, often in full view of British lines, a stark message against collaboration. The medical records from field hospitals paint a stark picture of this escalating ferocity. Bullet wounds were increasingly accompanied by assegai punctures, indicating close quarters combat where quarter was neither asked nor given. Amputation rates soared, not just from direct combat trauma, but from infections contracted in the unsanitary conditions of prolonged skirmishes and the deliberate poisoning of water sources. A tactic employed by both sides with devastating effect. Intelligence summaries from captured Zulu commanders spoke of a spiritual imperative to resist, a belief that the land itself would reject the invaders. This conviction fueled a fanatical courage, transforming ordinary warriors into relentless fighters who would charge into Maxim gunfire with an almost suicidal disregard for their lives. The British, in turn, interpreted this as savage obstinacy, further justifying their own harsh measures. The logistics of maintaining order in a territory actively resisting every inch of advance became an impossible drain on resources. Regimental quartermasters' ledgers show a quadrupling of ammunition expenditure per engagement by early 1880, far exceeding projections. The constant need for punitive expeditions diverted manpower from strategic objectives, trapping British forces in a cycle of localized, brutal engagements that yielded little lasting control. The psychological toll on the British ranks was profound. Diaries of junior officers, initially filled with a sense of adventure, gradually shifted to accounts of weariness, disillusionment, and a chilling normalization of violence. One entry simply stated, "The humanity has bled out of this place." the expectation of a swift, decisive campaign had dissolved into a grinding, dehumanizing struggle where the lines between combatant and civilian blurred irrevocably. The monsoon rains of 1879 brought not relief, but a deepening quagmire to the British positions. Despite the Martini-Henry rifle's superior range and stopping power, its advantage was often negated by the terrain and the elusive tactics of the Afghan fighters. A single well-placed jezail, firing a heavy hand-cast ball, could inflict a grievous wound at ranges exceeding those typically engaged by British skirmishers, particularly in the constricted passes and rocky outcrops that defined the theater of operations. Regimental quartermaster reports from October 1879 show an alarming increase in expended ammunition per casualty inflicted, rising from an average of 45 rounds in open engagements to over 120 rounds in mountainous skirmishes. This inefficiency stemmed not from poor marksmanship, but from the enemy's ability to vanish into the landscape after a volley, only to reappear from an unexpected quarter. The British reliance on linear tactics and massed fire, honed on European battlefields, proved ill-suited to the fragmented, decentralized resistance. The logistical strain intensified with each passing month. Supply lines, already tenuous, became targets for constant harassment. Convoys moving through the Khyber and Bolan passes suffered attrition rates of nearly 15% to ambushes and raids, according to intelligence summaries compiled by the Quartermaster General's office in Peshawar. This constant drain on resources diverted significant manpower from combat roles, as entire companies were routinely assigned to escort duties, further diluting the effective fighting force. The expectation of a swift, decisive campaign, predicated on technological superiority and disciplined formations, dissolved into a grinding war of attrition. British officers, many of whom had served in India and anticipated a similar pattern of colonial subjugation, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to conform to their established models of warfare. The Afghan fighters, often operating in small, independent bands, prioritized survival and harassment over pitched battles, eroding British morale and resources with relentless, small-scale engagements. Medical journals from field hospitals recorded a rising incidence of melancholia among junior officers, a euphemism for battle fatigue and disillusionment, particularly after extended periods of outpost duty. The constant vigilance, the unpredictable nature of attacks, and the lack of a clear, identifiable front line wore down even the most resolute. The landscape itself became an antagonist, with its extremes of temperature and unforgiving topography contributing to widespread illness and exhaustion. The British command continued to issue orders for punitive expeditions, seeking to break the will of the resistance through overwhelming force. Yet each burning village or captured stronghold seemed only to galvanize further opposition, drawing more clans into the fray. The strategic objective of securing a stable buffer state appeared increasingly distant, replaced by the grim reality of perpetual occupation and conflict. By the close of 1879, the cost in both lives and treasure had begun to mount to an unsustainable level. Treasury records indicate that the annual expenditure on the Afghan campaign had already exceeded initial projections by 300%, reaching an estimated £17 million. The political will in London, initially robust, began to waver under the weight of mounting casualties and the seemingly endless drain on the imperial coffers.